Okay, we're back. We're live. We're ready for the 12 noon show. I'm Jay Fidell. Welcome back to ThinkTech. Today's show is part of our History is Here to Help series, and we'll be discussing the history of racism in America with Peter Hoffenberg and Gene Rosenfeld. Welcome to the show, Peter, Gene. It's so nice to have you here. So let's start with you, Peter. It's a subject that has been discussed so much, and it's been it's been driven into a history of the United States around slavery. And so many people say we're still, in the Civil War, and you see elements of that. But I think one of the great contributions to this discussion is religion, because religion was involved to, I suppose, defend slavery and to defend racism through all of our history. Am I right? Can you talk about that?
Happy to talk about it. I think when we talk about religion, if we want to talk about American Christianity, for example, and I think that's probably what you're referring to being the dominant faith. The interesting thing regarding race and slavery, at least, is in American history, the Bible can be used for both sides. So abolitionists like Garrison referred to their interpretation of Christianity. And of course, Calhoun and the Confederacy did as well. I would add a couple of things that perhaps your viewers would find of interest. One is that the relationship between Christianity and race or ethnicity predates formal slavery. Jelani Cobb and I had this discussion. The imprint of race is initially the imprint on white ethnic Christian Europeans and Native Americans. That's the first imprint, which is not to deny the power of anti-Black sentiment here, but that I think if you look historically, right, part of the framing was already there by thinking of Native Americans in religious terms and in racial terms, if we use race in an ahistorical way. I mean, modern race is a 19th century phenomenon.
Yeah, there were heathens.
Right. So we could talk about religious and ethnic distinctions, and certainly ethnicity can slide into race in American history. So one thing I would like the viewers to do, but very carefully. I mean, I don't want this to be a kind of argument where you respond to Black Lives Matter by saying other lives matter, right? I don't want that, but when we think historically, I'd like us to think about the imprint of Native Americans. And secondly, I think part of the difficulty in discussing this in American history is the linkage of race and slavery. So the argument then in America's history goes, of course, that 700,000 men lost their lives fighting slavery. Slavery was overthrown. Now let's get on with life, right? So I think very importantly, and I'm sure Gene can talk about the post-1865 relationship, but that post-1865 relationship included religious justifications for lynching, religious justifications for denying voting, denying medical rights. So I guess the two things I'd like people to think about would be the predating of race, and not only the non-Black relationship, and our necessity of getting out of thinking that suddenly after 1865 things should have been okay. And I think historians like myself are really interested in what happens afterwards. And historically, the difficulties of emancipation are among the most fascinating histories: Brazil, South Africa, Jamaica, etc. So that would be my contribution. I want to turn to Gene, who has a much richer understanding of religion itself.
Okay, but before you do, let me make it clear that Peter is the contributor, if you will, the host of this program, the progenitor of it, if you will, and he's a history professor. And now he's going to take a moment and introduce Gene.
With my great pleasure. So Gene Rosenfeld, for some of you who listened in 2 weeks ago, you might recognize her. She's dressed a little differently today. She is an expert on not just the nature of religion, but the relationship between religion and populism, religion and terrorism. She has a well-received publication in light of Maoris and religion in New Zealand. And we've asked her today for her own expertise and for her work with Professor David Rappaport on the questions of the relationship between terrorism and American history, particularly in light of American religions. So we'll discuss the impact of overseas religions some other time, but this is particularly of interest in regard to what we might call homegrown religions. And so I want to turn it over to Jean, and I would like to learn with all the rest of you.
Gene, what about religion? We should define our terms. We're not talking about the classical religions here. We're talking about a takeoff religions, aren't we?
I said, in a sense, we are, Jay. There are some what I call off-road religions that call themselves Christian and that call themselves nature religions, natural religions, that inform white supremacy today. I think one thing I would like to establish, without getting into the definitional argument, is that the people who assaulted our Capitol consider themselves deeply religious. The people in the 1980s who formed a small secret cell that went about murdering and mayhem and major robbery called the Brüder Schweigen, which means the Silent Brotherhood. They were people who considered themselves religious. And both of these religions, Wotanism in the one hand, which is a natural religion that's somewhat like Charles Darwin and nature's God in the Constitution that they hark back to, and Christian identity, which is the religion of the white supremacy today, considers both Jews and Blacks in a different way. The Jews are children of Cain and Satan, and the Blacks are the mud people, according to them, inferior to whites. And whites are established as the one race that is going to evolve into Superman, so to speak, in a Nietzschean sense. So these are ideas you will not find in the Old Testament, New Testament, standard Christianity, but they are very much a part of the American experience. And I would say, going back to what Peter said as an introduction, that our first experience of this kind of thinking was with the very first regional Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War. The South just couldn't stand the idea that it had lost the war. And I think they've been fighting it ever since on different battlefields. And we're seeing that again today. A lot of the prejudice today, racial prejudice, is a result of hanging on to that antebellum Southern notion of white superiority. And it is justified today by even some new religions that have grown up in this environment, both Christian identity and the ancient, what they consider to be the ancient Nordic or Aryan religions of Germany and Norway and Sweden and so forth.
Well, let me, I mean, that's really remarkable about the Ku Klux Klan and how they could come up with these things and somehow propagate them around the country. But query, there had to be a fertile ground for people to accept those notions. What was that fertile ground in other places, which had precious little to do with the Ku Klux Klan?
Well, do you mind if I get a little autobiographical here?
Sure.
I grew up in Compton, California. Have you heard of Compton? Yeah, well, two great tennis stars are from Compton and a lot of other great athletes, and most of them are Black. And I was a tar babe. We called ourselves the tar babes in the high school. And when I was 15 years old, I had my first job down at the corner malt shop run by a couple from the South. And there was a Southern contingent in Compton. They came in to work in the defense industries, which were very big in South LA. And one day, on a hot summer day, I had this job putting my chips in a pickle jar I was saving for college. And a little Black girl came in on a hot summer day and came up to the counter. There was hardly anybody there. And I was very shy and I really needed that job. And the woman who ran it called me into the back in the kitchen and she said, "We don't serve those people." She said, "We don't serve those people. Don't you serve her, because she will bring her friends in and then our business will, not be ours anymore. So I suddenly had to make a very sudden choice. I mean, I grew up in a segregated town in California. And I had a choice to make at age 15. Put the tip in my pickle jar or lose the job or, whatever. And I didn't have any background, you see. So we all have choices when we reach that age of reason. And fertile ground, are you saying there's some other pre-existing notion of racism? Of course there is. In Europeans who populated the United States were the inheritors of the ideas of the explorers who considered the Indians a different kind of creature, not really human. And then slaves, of course, were not really human either. So that's the floor that we had to build racism on. So yes, I mean, every person that I know of that's white has had to make those kinds of decisions sometimes in their lives, and depending on what they decide.
Our religion has actively advanced this notion, and you go into, a congregation of one of these religions, one of these many religions, on a Sunday or whatever day they celebrate, and you're going to hear this rhetoric. Am I right? Even today.
Peter, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think in some cases, what you hear built into religion, regardless, is a sense of difference, is a sense of distinction. And I think the question to ask, I defer to Jean, but let me just ask it as a historian, right? Is this a religion where the distinctions and differences are either immutable, cannot be changed? So for example, we think of the difference between Jesuits in the New World and non-Jesuits, right? So Jesuits certainly believed in Native Americans being different, but they believed Native Americans had souls. So what they're saying is, yes, you are different, but there is an essential commonality. And as a Jesuit, I believe in free will, that you can find that commonality. All right, that's a religious answer as well. So all religions set out distinctions. They all have hierarchies. I think the larger question or way to ask is the role of religion in society. And that's a question of religiosity and liberalism, right? So the problem with extremist religions is not necessarily that they are an extreme religion. It's that they won't tolerate any other religion. And that I think is the great difficulty. And that's the 19th century response, that religions can coexist as long as they let other religions coexist. Now, what you're really asking then is, what are the seeds of intolerance, right? Intolerance. And what are the seeds of an apocalyptic vision that either I'm going to win or I'm going to win by destroying the world? Because a lot of these also have a kind of apocalyptic millenarian visions which are attached to militarism. I would include, in Jean's discussion, which is very, very helpful, we'd have to ask, for example, about a group like the Jewish Defense League, or Goldstein, who murdered upwards of 40 Arabs and Muslims, right? That they're Jewish, right? But their view of Judaism is a view of intolerance, having an apocalyptic vision. Where does that begin? Well, I think in American history, remember, I'm a European historian, I'm not an American historian. I still think it really begins with New England. The early wars, there were bloody wars in New England between Native Americans. And this is while slavery is going on, but slavery is not necessarily a large scale endeavor, even at that point.
Let me complicate it for you, Gene. It's my job.
You do it well, too. You do it really well.
The interesting thing is, you look in the Old Testament, you look in the New Testament, there's nothing in there about white supremacy. And yet this is coattailed on religion emanating from the Old Testament and the New Testament. The other thing that seems to run parallel, especially now, is that religion seems to be justifying violence. As you said, the insurrectionists who were into violence were religious. And what is the connection? So now we have three elements in in the discussion. We have racism, we have religion, and we have violence. Where does violence come in? How can religion justify violence?
That's been my major question for years and years and years. And it started out with David Rappaport asking me a question. And it's not exclusive to what we call the white race. I'm not a favorite of racial theory, but the white race. It happens all over the world, unfortunately, having to do with a kind of tribal view of, this is my land, these are my people, this is my language, this is my heritage. And we have kind of a white tribalism going on today. As for where does violence come out of religion? Usually by taking a text and reinterpreting it in a way that is not standard or normal. And just the best example I can think of actually comes with jihadism. Jihadism originated pretty much with a manifesto left at the site of the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. The assassins were taking on the religious experts in Cairo. And there was a verse in the Quran that, verse 9:5, called the verse of the sword. They took one half of that verse because the second half mitigated the violence. They took the violent half of that verse as the basis for announcing a new pillar of Islam. And a pillar means a rule that you can't break. And they elevated it to the second most important pillar of Islam, along with giving alms and making the pilgrimage and, declaring God the only God. And that was jihad, that you had to commit it. You had to commit it physically. And that's how jihadism started, by a justification of violence in order to, quote unquote, purify and preserve the religion. And they declared themselves the only group that was going to survive until the end of the world and be admitted into paradise. And so that young people who came into contact with this would make a decision. Am I going to be part of the group that enters into paradise? Or am I going to be part of all these 71 other groups that aren't going to enter into paradise? Now that seems pretty weird to us, but unfortunately, this kind of radical dualism where you have to choose one or the other, there's no gray area. It starts out with a religious justification based on a religious text that comes from a higher authority than an earthly authority, the deity to which you give your faith. And then people have to make their decisions based on this.
Peter, we have a problem. We have people who would like to bring the government down, who do violence, who actually want to stop those who wish to limit the violence, talking about the Second Amendment. And fundamentally that springs out of religion, or a perversion of religion. And so is that our condition? Is that where we are? Is this the essence of the species? Or can we find a way to separate these things and have less violence, less racism out of religion? What do we have to do here?
You're asking me as a fellow Marxist, I would assume. The answer is economics. No, what do we have to do? Well, taking with great seriousness what Jean said, we have a kind of jihadism which is not reserved for here. And there's the response, I suppose, and I wish that I could put this into practice, is returning religion to where the founding parents thought of religion, and where liberalism thinks of religion as an exercise of spirituality and reform, not an exercise of violence. Now, how do we do that? I think Jean and I could probably speak for the next millennium. I think in the case of, say, for example, jihadism overseas, which has some very powerful roots in the 19th century, the answer has been, and I think the answer is still today, that movements, religious movements like jihadism and religious movements like this kind of Christianity take advantage of a sense of resentment and a sense of betrayal, and usually historically are when the state or the instruments of state are failing to deliver the goods that a government or state should deliver. And I don't mean that in an abstract way. If you look at the rise of radical Islam, while it has its religious roots, as Jean suggested, many of these radical groups also provide medical care and teaching and resources. So you want the blunt answer? The blunt answer is to create the good society, to get governments involved in creating jobs, in reduce inequality. I mean, in this country, at least perceived inequality is gasoline to all of this. All right, so that's your quick answer. Historically, temporarily, that now how do we, and do you want to know how to get rid of the violence? Well, you're talking to a gun control advocate, and now maybe some people are going to turn off the show. Talking about a sacred document, as Jean suggested, interpreting the Second Amendment as to allowing you to walk into a supermarket and murder 10 people is really precisely what Jean is saying. It is the interpretation of the Constitution as this timeless, divine document which allows you to fulfill whatever your apocalyptic dream would be. And I promise you, there was nobody around that table in Philadelphia who thought of that. So one thing would be to stop looking at the Constitution as a religious document. And that's really, I mean, Jean, you may feel differently, but people who talk about originalism, like Scalia and other justices, and to a certain degree, that's what they're talking about. You know, in the 1780s, this document was created. In this case, the founding parents are gods. And that should be interpreted. So two things quickly, because I know I ramble, I apologize to your listeners. One is to think of the Constitution in terms of law and justice, which evolves with time. And secondly, to provide a government with social services and reform, which, again, Jean might disagree. I mean, I think that there are leaders of these movements and there were followers of these movements. And what I can tell from a lot of followers is a sense of resentment that is exploited. From what a little bit I know, Jean knows much more than I do, that is exploited by the leaders. So the way is to take the followers and generate a society in which they don't feel betrayed and don't feel resentful. I mean, Hofstadter was right. I mean, American politics really is a politics in many cases of resentment. Okay, sorry, that's way too long.
Gene, I wanted to put some gloss on that, to propound a combination question to you. You know, in China, the most important thing is public order. We cannot tolerate the lack of public order. Sometimes that goes too far. Many times it goes too far. And the power, the usefulness of government is personal security, a social safety net, a peaceful existence where you can live out your life without having your life interrupted. And at the same time, you describe religion, and which I guess evolves all the time. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. Well, actually, in our time, usually worse. Religion here is evolving into racism and violence. It seems to me, just me, but it seems more all the time. And my question to you, or my combination point in Peter's question, is this: are these two things consistent? Can we have religion and workable government at the same time, or do they eat each other? Is it possible for them to work together?
Jean, you want to take that first?
Of course it is. And I think it, for the most part, does. I mean, every president in my lifetime, who I remember his inauguration, has used has referred to God, has referred to prayer, has referred to faith. At some point between the inauguration and the first address to the nation. So we do have phrases like under God, but again, you have a text and you can exploit the text as I tried to show. I think when you said religion binds us, that is really what religion does. It binds us. And we have to ask the question, how do we want to be bound to one another? Do we want to have a religion that justifies a kind of hierarchy of peoples, a caste system, as they had in India for many years? And it worked, by the way. It's very complex. I'm not demeaning India at all. India is an extremely religious society, where it has been up until the 21st century. Or do we want a society that isn't a religion that binds us together as a diverse set of groups? And that's how America was founded. We do have a civic religion, by the way. I do believe. And I do believe that the Constitution is a sacred text and is going to remain a sacred text. The problem is always interpretation, because that's 90% of religion, is how you interpret it. And we have two competing visions today. We have a vision of white heritage by the Republican Party, typified last July 4th in the speech that Trump gave to the nation, as basically a Christian, white, European nation whose heritage is being threatened by a great demographic shift to brown and Black people in the next few decades, and by individuals who are acting in a godless way. And you have the other view promoted by Biden, which is from basically out of his Catholicism, as a social justice view of the gospel as bringing love and peace and among diverse members of society, binding us all together. And that's basically the American view, because the colonies were not the same. There were Catholics and Quakers and Jews and Congregationalists and rebels of all kinds and atheists. And there were people from many different parts of Europe. It wasn't just a uniform society, even in those days. So nobody gets to hijack one group or another in America. The common vision of the city on the hill is a city of all peoples. We have to bear that in mind. I really think the way out of this is to redefine ourselves as a nation. Who are we? And where are we going? And that's what Michelle Obama posed. And we have to accept that. I think 60% of the people in this country do accept that. But we have to make that known. We have to make that part of our educational system. And I think we can educate our way out of this if we're determined to do it. Plus the fact, as you brought up, Jay, law and order is very important. A society has to protect its members. If it doesn't protect its members, then it really is open to extremes. And you recall that before Hitler came to power, people were threatened by his thugs and the brown shirts. And in Italy, the black shirts, the Arditi, frightened the people. And the political parties were so frightened, they just handed the keys to the kingdom to these two dictators. So we can't afford to hand the keys to the kingdom to people like, I hate to say it, Ron Johnson, Stephen King, Hawley, Cruz. We can't afford to go back to 1865.
Doesn't the clarification of all of this?
Okay, sorry, I was just going to say Gene's a far nicer person than I am. Far calmer, far more reasonable. I think the problems, well, she's describing very important cultural and intellectual problems. I think there are some extremely important material problems that if this country is going to get back on track, we have to decide whether, we have a major question to decide. The largest question to decide, in my mind, is whether the government, the federal government, will be allowed We talk all about nationalism all the time. We are the only modern industrial society that doesn't have industrial planning. So we like nationalism when it comes to flags. We like nationalism when we bomb somebody else. But most other industrial societies recognize nationalism thrives in a legitimate way when there is national policy. So we are back to where we started talking about 2 years ago. We have to find some way to resolve not just the question of my right to have a gun, but my state's rights to decide, for example, what will be the wages within this state or not. Jean is a very kind, intelligent, articulate person. As a less kind, less intelligent, less articulate person, I think that we are talking about a cultural kind of nationalism and an intellectual, ideological kind of nationalism, which will allow fundamental inequality to persist. The second point, and it's going to get me in big trouble, so we can talk about this next time, is I happen to agree with who's the young man from Texas? Is it Beto O'Rourke? I happen to agree that religion as a sphere has no greater value to our society than any other sphere, and therefore should be taxed. I think the idea of religious contributions and religious life being off the tax record, off our ability to generate revenue, elevates religion to this kind of special status, which is one of the problems we have in our society. And apropos of what Jean said about India, one of India's problems. So much for the caste system when Hindu revivalists are running around destroying Islamic societies and Islamic villages. So I agree with Jean's very important understanding of religion and nationalism. But as a materialist, I think those exist in the ethereal realm, which have a real discordance with public, economic, and social life. So I'm all for taxing. I'm all for taxing churches and any temples. They should all be taxed.
Gene, back in the day, in the Founders' Day, I think maybe long before that, religions were excluded from tax. They were not taxed, and there was an agreement, I think, between the church and the state, where the church said, okay, we won't tax you, but you have to stay out of politics. Hence the First Amendment, that the national government would not establish religion, separation of church and state. And that's clearly in the last few administrations that has faded. And now churches get actively involved in politics. They raise money, they find ways to make huge contributions, people like Trump. They take political positions, they lobby like it's going out of style. I would tend to agree with Peter. They have outworn that agreement. And there's no good reason policy-wise now, these days, to respect an agreement which is no longer relevant. What do you think?
Well, there are two things I think we have to bear in mind here. One is that religion exists among the people, the vox populi. They're the ones who decide whether they are freely exercising their faith in a diverse society and are allowed to, so that unlike in some societies, a steeple doesn't have to be higher than a dome or a dome higher than a steeple. You know how they make those rules? Everything's supposed to exist on the same level. And traditionally, religion is inseparable from politics. It's always been inseparable from politics because religion to some extent will always be with human beings. We are religiously expressive. And I think the founders recognized that. The problem is they didn't want the state to hijack the church and use it for their own purposes, as it was done in the religious wars of Europe, out of which the settlers came to this continent. They did not want a repeat of that. They were the dissenters. They were the ones who were persecuted. Now it seems like the tables have turned. But nevertheless, mainstream religion has contributed a great deal to our society. It's not the same kind of institution as other institutions. It doesn't have a state purpose. That's why I think that's why religion and state are separate in the Constitution. There is no and should not be any political purpose to any religion. What you see today is a result of the weakness of traditional religions, which began in the early part of the 20th century with the backlash against biblical criticism in Europe that looked upon the Bible as a text, not as the word of God, in the seminaries. And so you had the fundamentalist movement. And the fundamentalist movement has become stronger and stronger and stronger. It's a literal taking of the word, but again, it can't resist interpretation, and that interpretation becomes very narrow. I would say, though, that we need to bear in mind that religion contributes to our humanity and our brotherhood and sisterhood with one another. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Religion needs to be stronger in our society, the type of religion that binds us together and promotes a social gospel and tolerance, because this is where individuals find their motivation and meaning in life. We can't take that away from people. They've tried that in China. It hasn't worked. Churches go underground, and then when things are freer, they come back up. They persist and persist and persist. It is one of the most persistent cultural attributes of a human society, is the way we express our relationship to what we consider to be the divine.
I think we're almost out of time, Peter,
Okay.
but I do want to offer you the opportunity to thank Jean and to summarize the essence of where we have gone today.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you, Jean, very much. I think if I were giving a lecture and I want students to leave with 3 points, and Jean, correct me if I misrepresent you. One is to give us a broader understanding of religion outside of just an institution. For example, what are the social and cultural meanings of religion as perhaps a cultural network, an intellectual life, an emotive life, which provides some humanity. Secondly, that in American history, there are many important times in which religion has expressed itself publicly very differently than the way we're thinking today. So not, for example, every church in American history has stormed the Capitol or always been racist, okay? And I think thirdly, what Jean has helped us understand, or I would say at least open the question, I don't think we've gotten the answer, is the relationship between violence and religion, or some religions. And I think Jean has asked some questions and helped us along that path. But I don't think we're not going to be able to.
Okay, well, clearly we have to continue.
There's a lot more. And as a good guest, Jean has always raised questions as well as provided answers. And I see Jean right there. So Jean, you have the last word.
Jean, what did you want to add
last
to that?
word.
Yeah.
Very briefly wanted to say that when I went out there as a shy 15-year-old girl back into the restaurant, I served that little Black girl. And the only thing that gave me the strength to do that was my Catholic faith at that time.
Interesting.
I
Interesting.
want to leave you thinking about that.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
regrettably, we're out of time. Been watching the History is Here to Help series on ThinkTech. We've been discussing the history of racism in America, maybe a little about violence in America, with Peter Hoffenberg and Jean Rosenfeld. Thank you very much, Peter, Jean. We
Thank
appreciate your time and contribution to this important public conversation. Look forward to a continuation and getting together again with you soon. I'm Jay Fidell. Aloha.